For part 2 of this video, we will be assembling the motherboard tray, which was salvaged from an old server, which will then go into the acrylic box and into the Mac Pro case that we built in the last video. I needed to test fit the motherboard and GPU with the two panels for the motherboard tray in order to properly align the PCI slots for the GPU with the PCI slots on the motherboard. I used 4 spot welds to attach the two pieces together, as they will not be bearing much weight. I then inserted the two pieces that were welded together into the acrylic box to see how they would fit. I marked off 2 sections on the front of the case that needed to be cut off in order for the lip of the case to slide around the outside of the metal housing. I used a Dremel to carefully cut the red line I had marked. After this, the metal housing fit securely around the side of the acrylic box. However, I still needed to cut off a remaining portion of the metal case that overlapped. I then used motherboard standoffs to attach the motherboard to the tray as well. I then secured the GPU with 2 screws which held it to the PCI bracket and also gave it more stability as well. Unfortunately, when I first test fit the case, I realized that the CPU cooler was about 2 centimeters too long. My budget was pretty tight by this point, so I could not afford to buy a low-profile CPU cooler, so I tried to adapt what I had at the time. Unfortunately, there will be about a 20% loss in the efficiency of this heatsink. However, I won't be overclocking the CPU, so it shouldn't be too much of an issue. Bending the heat pipes does not result in any loss of thermal performance. However, if you do puncture the heat pipes, it will result in the CPU cooler losing most of its efficiency. After going very slow and carefully bending the pipes, I did not puncture any of the pipes, so I was able to proceed. I then reattached the CPU cooler to the motherboard. And after my CPU cooler emergency surgery, the motherboard tray finally fit into the acrylic box for the first time. Next, I had to modify the power supply bracket in order for the PSU to properly fit in the acrylic box. It was slightly too long, so I had to trim it down. I used motherboard standoffs to offset the power supply bracket by about 3 centimeters, so I could offset the power supply by about 1 centimeter so it could clear the right side of the CPU cage. I then drilled 3 holes to attach the power supply bracket to the case. I then used a bunch of zip ties to somewhat neatly manage the cables. Next, I soldered 2 wires to the original power button on the front of the case so I could use it to turn on the computer. I taped these wires along a channel on the left side of the case so I could run them up to the motherboard tray in order to power the computer. Next, I cut the very last hole in the case. This hole is meant to show the GPU through the front of the case, which should look pretty cool when it's submerged in mineral oil. I had test fit the monitor with some electrical tape to make sure it would fit in the hole that I cut out earlier. Now it was time to dry test the computer for the first time. Hopefully nothing had broken in the process of assembling it. I plugged in the power cord and the motherboard lights immediately came on, so that was a good sign. However, when I pushed the power button, nothing came up on the LCD monitor. This was pretty stressful, however, I realized that it was a simple issue and I forgot to turn on the monitor. After I turned on the monitor, the computer booted up normally and I was ready to finally fill it with the oil. Filling the computer with mineral oil was definitely the most nerve-wracking part of this entire process, and it felt so wrong pouring a fluid that looked so much like water all over a very expensive computer. Finally, the computer was finished. The next day, I added a bubbler from the pet store as well as some rocks and fake plants for fish tanks. The thermals are surprisingly good and the CPU does not get above 60 degrees at load and stays around 30 degrees at idle. I'm able to game on it for at least 6 hours before I need to let the mineral oil cool down as there's no active cooling for the oil itself. Be sure to leave any questions you have in the comments. I'd be glad to help anyone who wants to build a mineral oil PC for themselves. But thanks for watching and stay tuned as there's many more videos coming this summer. Thanks.